The last thing I remember before my world shattered was my father's gentle hand on my shoulder, telling me we were going on a family vacation to celebrate my 18th birthday. 3 days later, I was locked in a basement 2,000 miles from home, sold like livestock for $200,000. The people who were supposed to protect me had become my destroyers, but they didn't know I'd survive. They didn't know I'd escape, and they certainly didn't know that 10 years later, I'd be wealthy enough to buy their freedom when they needed me most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Angela Davis, and I grew up believing family meant everything. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Bakersfield, California, where the summer heat could melt asphalt, and dreams felt as distant as the mountains on the horizon. My parents, Robert and Linda Davis, ran a small auto repair shop that barely kept us afloat. My younger brother, Marcus, was 15, obsessed with video games and basketball, living in that beautiful bubble where he believed our parents could fix anything. I should have seen the signs earlier. The hushed phone conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the way my father's hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the bills that kept piling up on the kitchen counter, marked with angry red stamps. My mother's eyes, once bright and warm, had grown hollow over the past year. She'd started drinking wine at lunch, claiming it helped with her headaches. The shop was failing. I knew that much. Customers had been dwindling since the new chain auto center opened across town, offering services we couldn't compete with. My parents had taken out loans, then more loans to pay the first ones. I'd overheard fragments of conversations about second mortgages and creditors calling. But I was 18, focused on my acceptance to community college and my part-time job at the local diner. I trusted them to handle the adult problems while I handled being young. When my father announced the family vacation to Las Vegas for my birthday, I was shocked. We hadn't taken a real trip in years. My mother seemed nervous about it, fidgeting with her wedding ring and asking strange questions about whether I'd told anyone where we were going. I thought she was just worried about the expense. I hugged her tight and told her not to stress, that we deserved this little getaway after all the hardship. The drive to Vegas was long and quiet. Marcus slept in the back seat while I watched the desert landscape blur past the window. My father kept checking his phone at red lights, his jaw clenched in that way it got when he was stressed about money. My mother stared straight ahead, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. I tried to start conversations about what we'd do in Vegas, maybe see a show or hit the buffets, but their responses were short and distracting. We stayed at a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind with flickering neon signs and carpet that smelled like decades of cigarettes and broken dreams. My parents said it was all they could afford, and I believed them. The room had 2 double beds and a broken air conditioner that rattled all night. I shared a bed with my mother, feeling her toss and turn beside me, her breathing shallow and anxious. On the second day, my father said he had to meet some business contacts about potentially selling the shop. He asked me to come along, claiming they might have advice about college and careers. My mother stayed at the motel with Marcus, saying she had a migraine. I remember being excited about meeting successful adults who might mentor me. I wore my best dress, the blue one I'd bought for graduation, and spent extra time on my makeup. The meeting was at a fancy restaurant downtown, the kind with cloth napkins and waiters in bow ties. My father seemed nervous as we walked in, constantly adjusting his collar and checking his watch. He introduced me to 2 men and a woman sitting at a corner table. They were well-dressed and friendly, asking about my plans for college and complimenting my dress. They ordered expensive wine and encouraged me to try it, saying it was a special celebration. I should have noticed how my father barely spoke during dinner, how he avoided eye contact with me, how his hands trembled when he reached for his water glass. The wine made me feel warm and relaxed, and these successful strangers seemed genuinely interested in my future. The woman, who introduced herself as Patricia, talked about internship opportunities in California that could help pay for school. The men, James and Carlos, discussed business ventures that might interest a smart young woman like me. When they suggested we continue the conversation at their hotel suite to look at some materials they'd brought, I didn't hesitate. My father said he'd wait in the lobby while I went upstairs with them. I hugged him goodbye, telling him I loved him, and thanked him for introducing me to such wonderful people. He hugged me back, but his embrace felt desperate, like he was trying to memorize the moment. The elevator ride to the 20th floor was the last time I felt safe. Patricia chatted about the city lights and how beautiful they looked from up high. James mentioned that their suite had an amazing view. Carlos stayed quiet, but I didn't think anything of it. I was 18 and naive, believing that successful adults in expensive clothes were automatically trustworthy. The suite was indeed beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the strip. They offered me more wine, and I accepted, feeling sophisticated and adult. We sat on the leather couches while they showed me brochures for what they claimed were job training programs. The wine was making me sleepy, more so than it should have after just 2 glasses. My words started slurring and I apologized, saying I wasn't used to drink. Patricia's voice became soothing, almost hypnotic, as she suggested I lie down for a few minutes. The room was spinning gently, and her suggestion seemed reasonable. I remember James helping me to the bedroom, his hand firm on my elbow. I remember thinking I should call my father, but my phone felt impossibly heavy in my purse. I remember Patricia's face above mine, no longer kind but coldly businesslike, as she said something about how everything was going to be different now. When I woke up, I was in the back of a moving vehicle, my hands zip-tied behind my back and duct tape over my mouth. The drugs they'd given me left me groggy and disoriented, but terrified clarity began cutting through the fog. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom. This was something much worse. Something I'd only seen in movies and news reports about other people's nightmares. The drive seemed endless. Through the small window, I watched the Nevada desert give way to Arizona mountains, then New Mexico plain. They stopped only for gas, never removing my restraints, feeding me energy bars and water bottles like I was livestock being transported. Patricia sat beside me, occasionally checking my pulse and temperature with the clinical detachment of someone who'd done this before. We finally stopped at a compound in rural Texas, surrounded by high fences and guard dogs. The buildings looked like a cross between a ranch and a prison, with barred windows and security cameras everywhere. As they pulled me from the van, my legs barely supporting me, I saw other girls being led between buildings. Some looked younger than me, others older, all with the same hollow expression of people who'd learned that screaming for help was pointless. They locked me in a basement room with concrete walls and a single mattress on the floor. There was a bucket in the corner for a bathroom and one small window near the ceiling that showed only a sliver of sky. The door was solid steel with multiple locks. For the first time since waking up in the van, I truly understood what had happened to me. My parents hadn't just lost me to criminals, they had sold me to them. The realization hit like a physical blow. My father's nervous behavior, my mother's guilt-ridden eyes, the strange questions about who knew where we were going. They had planned this. They had delivered me personally to these people, like a package being shipped to its destination. The family vacation, the birthday celebration, the business meeting, it had all been an elaborate lie to get me here willingly. I spent the first 3 days crying until I had no tears left. The woman who brought my meals, a tired-looking Hispanic woman named Rosa, wouldn't make eye contact or respond to my pleas for help. She just set down the tray of rice and beans and left, the locks clicking back into place behind her. I screamed until my voice was raw, pounded on the walls until my fists were bloody, and begged anyone who would listen to let me call my parents. On the 4th day, Patricia returned. She sat on a plastic chair while I remained on the mattress, and explained my situation with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. My parents had owed serious money to serious people, the kind of debt that doesn't get forgiven or forgotten. They had 2 choices: watch their entire family disappear, or give up one child to save the rest. They chose me because I was 18 and legal, because I was pretty enough to be valuable, and because they loved Marcus more. The number she mentioned made my stomach turn. $200,000. That's what my parents thought I was worth. That's what they'd received for delivering their firstborn daughter to human traffickers. She showed me the paperwork, legitimate-looking documents that transferred ownership of me to their organization. My father had signed it with the same pen he used to sign checks at the auto shop. Patricia explained the rules of my new existence with chilling efficiency. I would work to pay off my debt to the organization, plus interest, plus room and board, plus any medical expenses they incurred keeping me healthy. The math was designed to be impossible. I would never earn enough to buy my freedom. I would be moved between locations regularly to service clients who paid premium prices for young, educated American women. If I tried to escape, they would find me and kill not just me, but my entire family back in California. She showed me photos on her phone to prove they were serious. Pictures of my house, my brother walking to school, my parents at the auto shop. She had their schedules, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Marcus still didn't know what had happened to me. My parents had told him I'd decided to stay in Vegas for a job opportunity and would call soon. If I cooperated, they would continue believing that lie. If I didn't, their bodies would be found in the desert. The first client came that evening. I won't describe what happened, not because I want to protect him or myself, but because those details aren't necessary for you to understand the horror of my situation. What I will say is that it shattered whatever remained of the girl I used to be. The Angela who worried about college applications and boy problems and whether her hair looked good was gone, replaced by someone whose only goal was survival. For 6 months, I existed in a nightmare cycle of different rooms, different clients, different cities, but the same basic hell. They moved us every few weeks to avoid detection, rotating between compounds in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The other girls and I rarely spoke. Conversation was discouraged and often punished, but we communicated through glances and small gestures of solidarity when the guards weren't watching. I learned that most of the girls had similar stories: families in debt, promises of legitimate opportunities, then the sudden transition into captivity. Some had been taken younger, others older, but we all shared the experience of realizing that the people who should have protected us had instead delivered us to our destroyer. The psychological trauma of that betrayal was almost worse than the physical abuse we endured daily, but something inside me refused to break completely. Maybe it was stubbornness inherited from my father or the fierce independence my mother had always claimed to admire. Whatever it was, I began paying attention to details that might help me survive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Guard rotations, security weak points, the layout of each new location. I memorized faces, license plates, overheard conversations about schedules and routes. I also began studying the business side of my captivity with the same intensity I'd once applied to school assignments. I listened when Patricia and the other handlers talked about money, about which clients paid the most, about operational costs and profit margins. I realized this was a sophisticated criminal enterprise with weak points and vulnerabilities like any other business. The opportunity for escape came during a transfer between locations. We were being moved from Texas to Arizona in a convoy of 3 vehicles. I was in the middle van with 2 other girls and only one guard, a man named Tony who'd been drinking and was more focused on his phone than watching us. The driver was someone new, unfamiliar with the protocols, and he'd forgotten to properly secure my restraints. When we stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, Tony went inside to buy cigarettes, leaving us with the nervous driver. I had worked my hands partially free during the drive, and when the driver turned to pump gas, I slipped my restraints completely. The other girls looked at me with wide eyes, but I knew I could only save myself. Taking them would mean certain capture for all of us. I waited until the driver moved to clean the windshield, then slipped out the far side of the van and into the desert. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, but it was freedom. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then crawled, then walked, then ran again. Behind me I could hear shouting and car engines, but the darkness and terrain were on my side. For 3 days, I survived on cactus water and the emergency supplies I'd stolen from the van's glove compartment. I avoided roads and moved only at night, using the stars for navigation like my grandfather had taught me during childhood camping trips. My feet were raw and bleeding, my lips cracked from dehydration, but I was free for the first time in 6 months. On the fourth day, a border patrol agent found me collapsed near a highway. I was delirious from dehydration and exposure, babbling about trafficking and kidnapping. He probably thought I was an undocumented immigrant with a creative story, but he followed protocol and took me to a hospital. When I was stable enough to speak coherently, I told my story to FBI agents who specialized in human trafficking cases. The investigation that followed was both validating and devastating. My accounts led to raids on 2 of the compounds where I'd been held, resulting in the rescue of 15 other girls and the arrest of several low-level operators. But the main players, including Patricia, had vanished the moment they realized I'd escaped. They had cleaned out their operations and disappeared into the underground network that spans across international borders. More devastating was the conversation with the FBI agent assigned to my case, Special Agent Maria Santos. She explained that my parents would likely face federal charges for their role in trafficking me. The organization had recorded everything, including the meetings where my father negotiated my sale and signed the transfer document. They had video evidence of him delivering me to the traffickers and accepting payment. When Agent Santos asked if I wanted them to arrest my parents immediately, I found myself in an impossible position. Part of me wanted them to pay for what they'd done, to experience the consequences of their choice, but another part of me remembered that they had acted out of desperation, not malice. They had chosen between losing one child or losing all of us, and while their choice was unforgivable, I understood the impossible mathematics of their situation. I asked Agent Santos to wait. I needed time to decide what kind of justice I wanted and what kind of person I wanted to become after everything I'd survived. She agreed to delay the arrests while I entered a federal protection program and began the long process of rebuilding my life from nothing. The first year of freedom was harder than I'd expected. The physical healing was straightforward. Proper medical care, nutrition, and rest restored my body relatively quickly. The psychological healing was more complex. I had nightmares, panic attacks, and a hypervigilance that made normal social interactions feel impossible. Trust was a foreign concept when the people who should have loved me most had sold me into slavery. But I was alive, and I was free, and I was determined to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my former life. I enrolled in community college using a new identity provided by the Witness Protection Program. I studied business and computer science with an intensity that concerned my counselors, but I had a plan forming in the back of my mind. If I was going to survive in this world, I needed to understand how money worked and how to make it work for me. I also began volunteering with organizations that help trafficking survivors, sharing my story with law enforcement training programs, and testifying before congressional committees about the realities of modern slavery. The work was painful but necessary. Every person who heard my story and understood the signs might prevent another family from making the same devastating choice my parents had made. During my second year of freedom, I received news that changed everything. Agent Santos called to tell me that my parents had been arrested on unrelated charges. The auto shop had failed completely, and in their desperation to avoid bankruptcy and keep custody of Marcus, they had begun running drugs through their business. They were looking at serious federal time, and Marcus was in foster care. My brother, now 17, had been told that I had died in an accident in Las Vegas. My parents had maintained that lie for 2 years, letting him grieve a sister who was actually fighting for survival in trafficking compounds. When the FBI revealed the truth during their arrest, Marcus had a complete breakdown. He was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation and was refusing to see our parents or speak to anyone about our family. I flew back to California under heavy security, my heart pounding as I walked into the psychiatric facility where Marcus was being treated. He was thin and hollow-eyed, sitting by a window and staring at nothing. When he saw me, he didn't move for a full minute, like he was seeing a ghost. Then he started crying, deep sobs that seemed to come from his soul. We held each other and cried for what felt like hours. I told him everything, about the trafficking, about the escape, about the choices our parents had made. He told me about the years of believing I was dead, about how our parents had seemed broken and guilty, about how he'd blamed himself for not being a better son who could have somehow prevented my accident. Marcus was angry, angrier than I'd ever been, which surprised me. He wanted our parents to rot in prison for what they'd done to both of us. He felt betrayed not just by their decision to sell me, but by the years of lies that followed. He couldn't understand how I wasn't consumed with rage and thoughts of revenge. I tried to explain something I'd learned during my recovery. Anger is a luxury that trauma survivors can't always afford. Rage requires energy that I needed for healing and building a new life. But more than that, I had come to understand that our parents were both perpetrators and victims of a system that crushes desperate people and offers them impossible choices. That didn't excuse what they'd done, it didn't make their choice forgivable or understandable in any meaningful way, but it did make them human beings who had made a terrible decision under crushing circumstances, rather than monsters who had coldly calculated my destruction. Over the next several months, as my parents awaited trial and Marcus worked through his trauma with excellent therapists, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I was going to build wealth, serious wealth, not for luxury or status, but for power. The power to change desperate circumstances that force people into impossible choices. The power to rescue people who need rescuing. The power to offer alternatives when the world seems to offer only terrible options. I threw myself into building a technology company with the same intensity I'd once applied to survival. The business idea came from my experience in the trafficking world. I had seen how these organizations use technology to coordinate their operations, track their victims, and avoid law enforcement. I realized that similar technology could be used to track down traffickers and help survivors rebuild their lives. Working with other survivors and former law enforcement agents, I developed an app that allowed people to discreetly report suspected trafficking situations, connected survivors with resources and support, and helped law enforcement agencies coordinate rescue operations. The technology itself wasn't revolutionary, but the way we applied it to this specific problem created something genuinely useful. The app gained attention from law enforcement agencies and humanitarian organizations around the world. We received grants from governments and donations from wealthy individuals who wanted to support anti-trafficking efforts. Within 3 years, we had expanded into a full platform that included survivor services, law enforcement training, and public education campaigns. The financial success was beyond anything I had imagined when I started. We were processing millions of dollars in grants and donations, taking a small percentage for operations, and reinvesting the rest into expanding our services. I was personally earning more money than my parents had ever dreamed of, and I was doing it by fighting the same criminal networks that had once enslaved me. But success brought its own complicated emotion. Every time I deposited a check or reviewed our growing bank accounts, I thought about the $200,000 my parents had received for selling me. I was now earning that amount every few months, money that came from helping people rather than destroying them. The irony was not lost on me. During our 4th year of operation, Agent Santos called with news that my parents' trial was finally approaching. They were facing 25 years for drug trafficking charges, completely separate from their role in my trafficking case. The prosecutors were willing to offer reduced sentences if they provided information about other criminal networks, but they had refused to cooperate. Marcus, now 21 and working as a counselor for at-risk youth, still refused to have any contact with our parents. He had legally changed his last name and referred to them only as the people who used to be my family. He supported himself through college and his job, refusing any financial help from me, because he didn't want to feel dependent on anyone ever again. I had visited our parents exactly once since their arrest, an awkward and painful meeting in a federal detention facility. They looked older, grayer, broken by years of guilt and consequences. My father cried when he saw me, kept saying he was sorry that he never thought they would hurt me, that he believed they would just use me for legitimate work until the debt was paid. My mother was harder, angrier, defensive about their choice. She insisted they had no alternatives, that the people they owed would have killed all of us if they hadn't complied. She seemed to want me to forgive them, to tell them I understood, to absolve them of the choice they'd made. I couldn't give her that absolution, but I also couldn't bring myself to hate them completely. As their trial date approached and I wrestled with decisions about testimony and forgiveness, I received a call that changed my perspective entirely. Agent Santos had been contacted by prosecutors in Texas who were finally building a case against Patricia and her organization. They had arrested several members of the trafficking network and were offering deals in exchange for information about the financial structure of the operation. What they had discovered was staggering. My parents weren't the only desperate families who had sold children to pay debts. Patricia's organization had been systematically targeting families in financial crisis, offering them the same impossible choice my parents had faced. They had dozens of videos showing parents negotiating the sale of their children, signing documents and accepting payment. The prosecutors wanted me to testify not just about my own trafficking experience, but about the broader pattern of how these organizations exploited family desperation. They believed my testimony, combined with the videos and financial records, could help convict the entire leadership of a network that had trafficked hundreds of people over decades. I agreed immediately. This was bigger than my personal trauma or my complicated feelings toward my parents. This was about stopping an organization that was still destroying families and enslaving children. My parents had made a terrible choice, but they were also victims of a system designed to exploit exactly the kind of desperation they had experienced. The federal trial lasted 6 weeks and was emotionally exhausting. I testified for 2 full days, describing my trafficking experience in clinical detail while Patricia and 3 other defendants sat 10 feet away from me. She looked older and harder than I remembered, but her eyes still held the same cold calculation that had terrified me as an 18-year-old girl. The defense attorneys tried to portray the parents as willing participants who had essentially sold their children for profit, but the videos told a different story. You could see the desperation in these parents' faces, the tears, the obvious anguish over the choice they were making. They weren't criminal masterminds, they were broken people being manipulated by professional predators. When the verdicts came back guilty on all counts, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything money or success had provided. Patricia received life in prison without parole. Her organization was dismantled, their assets seized, their network disrupted. 15 other people received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years, but the victory felt incomplete. While my own parents sat in a different federal facility awaiting their own sentence. The prosecutors in their case had been following the trafficking trial and reached out to discuss a possible plea agreement. They were willing to consider reduced sentences if my parents provided cooperation about other criminal networks they'd encountered. I found myself in another impossible position. I had the influence to potentially affect my parents' sentences, to advocate for mercy or justice depending on my perspective. Marcus made his position clear: they deserved whatever consequences they received, and he didn't want me to intervene on their behalf. He felt that any leniency would minimize the trauma we'd both experienced. Agent Santos helped me understand my options without pushing me toward any particular choice. I could testify at their sentencing hearing about the impact of their actions, potentially influencing whether they received the maximum or minimum sentences within the guidelines. I could remain silent and let the justice system proceed without my input, or I could actively advocate for mercy based on the context I now understood about how trafficking organizations manipulated desperate families. The decision came to me during a conversation with another trafficking survivor who had become a close friend through our recovery work. She pointed out something I hadn't fully considered. My parents were still victims of the same organization that had enslaved me. Patricia's network had deliberately targeted families in crisis, offering them an impossible choice designed to exploit their desperation and love for their children. That didn't excuse their decision or minimize the trauma it had caused, but it did place their choice in a broader context of systematic exploitation rather than individual moral failure. They had been manipulated by professional criminals who understood exactly how to pressure people into making unthinkable decisions. I decided to write a letter to the judge handling my parents' sentencing. In it, I described my trafficking experience, my recovery, and my current work fighting these organizations. I explained that while I couldn't forgive my parents' choice, I understood it as part of a pattern of exploitation that these criminal networks used against vulnerable families. I asked the judge to consider a sentence that would allow my parents to eventually reunite with Marcus and attempt to rebuild their family relationships. Not because they deserved mercy, but because breaking families apart was exactly what trafficking organizations intended to accomplish. Every family destroyed by these consequences was another victory for the criminal networks we were trying to defeat. The letter was the hardest thing I'd ever written, requiring me to set aside my own trauma and anger to consider what justice actually meant in this situation. I wasn't advocating for my parents because I loved them or forgave them. I was advocating for a response that would strengthen families and communities rather than further fragmenting them. At the sentencing hearing, I sat in the front row as my parents learned their fate. The judge had clearly read my letter and considered its arguments. She sentenced them to 12 years each, significantly less than the maximum, but still substantial enough to reflect the seriousness of their crimes. With good behavior, they would be eligible for release in 8 years. My father cried when he saw me in the courtroom. My mother looked stunned that I had advocated for mercy rather than maximum punishment. Marcus wasn't there, he was still processing his anger, and wasn't ready for that level of emotional complexity. But I felt something like peace, knowing I had chosen justice over revenge. After the sentencing, I made a decision that surprised everyone who knew my story. I was going to pay for my parents' legal representation for their appeals, and provide financial support for Marcus, whether he wanted it or not. Not because I forgave them, or wanted to resume a family relationship, but because I had the resources to prevent further trauma and I believed that was the right choice. The money I used came directly from the success of the anti-trafficking company we'd built. There was something powerfully symbolic about using profits from fighting trafficking to support the family that had been torn apart by trafficking. It felt like closing a circle, transforming destruction into reconstruction. Marcus was furious when I told him about my decision. He felt I was betraying him by helping the people who had destroyed our family. He couldn't understand how I could separate my desire for justice from my need for revenge. We had several painful conversations where he accused me of Stockholm Syndrome and enabling criminal behavior. But over time, as he continued his own therapy and worked with other trauma survivors, Marcus began to understand my perspective. He didn't have to agree with my choices or participate in them, but he could see that they came from a place of strength rather than weakness. He eventually accepted my financial support for college and his work with the at-risk youth, though he maintained that he would never have a relationship with our parents. 5 years later, as I write this story, my parents are still in federal prison with 3 years remaining on their sentences. I visit them twice a year. Awkward meetings where we try to navigate a relationship that has no precedent or roadmap. They express gratitude for my advocacy and support, but also guilt that seems to consume them more each year. Marcus and I have rebuilt a relationship based on mutual respect rather than shared trauma. He's now a successful counselor who specializes in helping young people who've been exploited by adults they trusted. He still refuses to discuss our parents or consider any form of reconciliation, but he no longer asks me to choose between supporting him and helping them. The anti-trafficking organization has expanded internationally and helped rescue over 300 people from slavery. We've provided services to thousands of survivors and trained law enforcement agencies in 47 countries. The work is both personally meaningful and financially successful, allowing me to build wealth that I use to fight the same networks that once enslaved me. But the most important outcome isn't professional or financial. It's the understanding I've gained about the difference between justice and revenge, between accountability and destruction. My parents made an unforgivable choice that destroyed my childhood and traumatized our entire family. They deserve consequences for that choice, and they're serving them, yet they were also victims of a criminal organization designed to exploit family desperation and turn love into a weapon. Recognizing that complexity doesn't excuse their decision, but it does inform how I choose to respond to it. I've learned that healing sometimes requires choosing reconstruction over revenge, even when revenge feels more satisfying. Today, I'm 30 years old and building a life I never could have imagined when I was locked in that basement in Texas. I have meaningful work, financial security, and relationships, based on honesty rather than desperation. I've used my trauma as fuel for fighting the same systems that created it, transforming my worst experience into my life's mission. In 2 years, my parents will be released from prison. Marcus has made it clear he doesn't want to be involved in any reunion or reconciliation. I'm not sure what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with them, but I know I'll help them rebuild their lives, because I have the resources to do so and because breaking cycles of trauma requires someone to choose healing over revenge. The girl who was sold for $200,000 is gone, replaced by a woman who understands that justice is complex and healing is possible even after unthinkable betrayal. I survived trafficking, built wealth, and chose mercy over vengeance, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let trauma make you into someone you don't want to be. My family sold me to traffickers, but I bought my own freedom and chose to buy theirs too. That choice doesn't make what they did acceptable, but it makes me someone who can live with herself and sleep peacefully at night. Sometimes that's all the justice any of us can hope for. The compound in rural Texas looked like a fortress disguised as a ranch. High concrete walls topped with razor wire surrounded several single-story buildings that could have housed cattle or equipment, but instead contained something far more sinister. Guard towers positioned at each corner gave armed men clear sightlines across the entire property, while motion sensors and cameras tracked every movement within the perimeter. My first week in captivity passed in a haze of terror and disbelief. The basement room where they kept me measured roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, with cement walls that wept moisture and a ceiling so low I could touch it by standing on my toes. The single window near the ceiling showed only a narrow strip of sky, never revealing whether it was morning, afternoon, or evening. Time became meaningless when measured only by the arrival of meals and the sound of footsteps in the hallway above. Rosa, the woman who brought my food, spoke only Spanish and seemed as trapped as the rest of us. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned that drawing attention was dangerous. Her eyes held the same hollow look I was beginning to recognize in all the women here, the expression of people who had surrendered hope in order to survive. When I tried to communicate with her through gestures and broken Spanish, she would shake her head frantically and hurry away. The meals themselves were basic but sufficient: rice and beans, occasionally chicken or vegetables, always served on paper plates with plastic utensils that couldn't be used as weapons. They fed us enough to keep us healthy but not enough to give us energy for resistance. I quickly learned to eat everything they brought, even when my stomach was churning with anxiety, because skipping meals meant weakness and weakness meant vulnerability. Patricia returned on my 8th day, accompanied by a man I hadn't seen before. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in this grim environment. They spoke in hushed tones while examining a clipboard, occasionally glancing at me like I was livestock being evaluated for mark. The man nodded approvingly at whatever Patricia was telling him, and I felt my stomach drop as I realized this was some kind of inspection or approval process. She introduced him as Mr. Rodriguez, explaining that he oversaw operations for their entire network across the southwestern United States. He asked me to stand, turn around, smile, and answer basic questions about my health and background. The clinical nature of the evaluation was somehow more disturbing than outright cruelty would have been. They were treating me like a commodity, assessing my value with the same detachment a car dealer might use to appraise a used vehicle. Rodriguez seemed pleased with what he saw. He complimented Patricia on her selection, noting that educated American girls brought premium prices from certain clientele. They discussed my training schedule and placement options as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away listening to every word. The dehumanization was deliberate and complete. They wanted me to understand that I was no longer a person with rights and choices, but property to be managed and utilized for profit. The training they mentioned began the next morning. A different woman, older and harder than Patricia, came to my cell with a set of rules that would govern every aspect of my existence. She called herself Supervisor Maria and spoke with the authority of someone who had broken many girls before me. The rules were extensive and specific: when to speak, how to address clients, what behaviors would be rewarded or punished, and the consequences for any attempt at resistance or escape. She explained the debt system that would supposedly govern my eventual freedom, though the numbers made it clear that freedom was never the actual goal. I owed $200,000 for my purchase price, plus 30% annual interest. Room and board cost $500 per week. Medical care, clothing, and any other necessities would be added to my debt at inflated prices. Meanwhile, I would earn credits for each client served, with the amount varying based on the services provided and the client's payment level. The mathematics were deliberately impossible. Even if I served multiple clients daily and earned maximum credits, the interest and expenses would accumulate faster than I could pay them down. The debt was designed to grow indefinitely, ensuring that no one ever earned their freedom through compliance alone. This realization was meant to break our spirits and force us to accept that cooperation was our only path to survival. But something in me refused to accept their version of reality. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the analytical mind that had always served me well in school. Instead of despairing over the impossible mathematics, I began studying them. I memorized the rates, the fees, the interest calculations, looking for inconsistencies or weaknesses in their system. If this was a business, it had to have vulnerabilities like any other business. The physical preparation for client services was systematic and degrading. They provided specific clothing, makeup, and instructions on appearance and behavior. Everything was designed to create a fantasy for the men who paid to abuse us. We were supposed to appear willing, enthusiastic, and grateful for their attention. The acting required was almost as difficult as the physical abuse itself, pretending to enjoy experiences that were traumatizing us. My first client arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October. He was a businessman from Houston, probably in his 50s, who spoke to me like I was a willing participant in some kind of romantic encounter rather than a victim of trafficking. This delusion seemed to be part of what these men paid for, the ability to pretend that young women genuinely desired their attention and touch. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it also revealed something important about their psychology. I won't describe the details of what happened that night or the many nights that followed. Those experiences belong to me, and sharing them serves no purpose beyond sensationalism. What I will say is that each encounter taught me something about the men who created the demand for this industry. They weren't monsters in the way I had expected. They were ordinary men who had convinced themselves that paying for sex made it consensual, regardless of the circumstances surrounding its availability. Over the following weeks, as different clients rotated through, I began to understand the broader ecosystem that sustained human trafficking. These weren't predators lurking in dark alleys. They were lawyers, doctors, businessmen, politicians, and family men who justified their participation through willful ignorance about how young women ended up available for their pleasure. They paid premium prices specifically because we were young, American, and educated, fetishizing qualities that made our exploitation more valuable. The other girls in the compound came from similar backgrounds, middle-class families, who had fallen into desperate circumstances and made unthinkable choices. There was Jennifer, 19, whose parents had sold her to pay for her younger brother's cancer treatment. Maria, 22, had been traded for her family's gambling debts in Las Vegas. Sarah, just 18, like me, had been given up to settle her father's drug obligations in Phoenix. We rarely had opportunities to talk, but when we did, during brief moments between clients or in shared spaces, we exchanged fragments of our stories. None of us had been randomly kidnapped from parking lots or bus stops. All of us had been delivered by people who were supposed to love and protect us. The pattern was clear and intentional. Patricia's organization specifically targeted families with financial crises and children who could be valuable in the trafficking market. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the debt system and physical control. They regularly showed us news articles about trafficking victims who had tried to escape and been murdered, along with their family. They had detailed information about our loved ones back home, addresses, routines, vulnerabilities, and made it clear that any resistance would result in consequences for people we cared about. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional and psychological, cutting us off from any source of hope or support. But they made a crucial mistake in my case. By emphasizing the business aspects of our situation, they inadvertently taught me how their operation functioned. I learned about profit margins, operational costs, and market demands. I understood which types of clients paid the most, which services generated the highest revenues, and how the money flowed through their organization. This knowledge would prove crucial later, but at the time it simply helped me maintain some sense of agency in a situation designed to eliminate all control. The seasonal patterns became evident after several months in captivity. Demand increased during certain times of year. Business conferences, holiday seasons, and major sporting events brought more clients willing to pay premium prices. They moved us between locations based on these patterns, always staying ahead of law enforcement attention while maximizing profits. The logistics were sophisticated, involving safe houses, transportation networks, and corrupt officials who ensured minimal interference. My second relocation came in December, moving from Texas to a facility outside Phoenix. The new compound was larger and better appointed, with private rooms instead of basement cells and more elaborate security systems. This wasn't an improvement in our treatment, it was a reflection of the higher-end clientele they serviced from this location. The men who visited here paid more and expected more luxurious surroundings for their exploitation activities. The Phoenix facility housed about 20 girls, ranging in age from 16 to 25. The younger ones had been there longer and showed the psychological damage of extended captivity. They moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, no longer fighting or hoping but simply existing from one moment to the next. I was terrified of becoming like them, losing whatever spark of resistance still burned inside me. Supervisor Maria was replaced by a man called Director James, who ran the Phoenix operation with military precision. He had clearly been in the trafficking business for years and understood exactly how to manage both the victims and the clients. His approach was different from the crude intimidation tactics used at the Texas facility. He relied more on psychological manipulation and the illusion of choice to maintain control. Under James's system, girls who cooperated fully and met certain performance standards could earn small privileges, better food, cosmetics, books to read during downtime. Those who caused problems faced isolation, reduced meals, and threats against their family. It was a sophisticated behavior modification program designed to make compliance seem like the rational choice, while making resistance appear futile and dangerous. The Phoenix clientele was indeed more upscale than what I had experienced in Texas. Many were wealthy professionals who traveled to Arizona for business or pleasure, and wanted discreet access to young women during their stay. They paid significantly more than the rougher clients from Texas, which meant higher earnings credits for us but also higher expectations for our performance and appearance. James introduced me to the concept of regulars, clients who specifically requested the same girl for multiple visits. This was presented as a privilege that could lead to better treatment and higher earnings, but I quickly realized it was actually another form of psychological manipulation. Having regular clients created artificial relationships that made some girls feel valued and special, even within the context of their exploitation. One of my regulars was a man named Thomas, a finance executive from Denver who came to Phoenix monthly for business meetings. He was different from the other clients, quieter, more thoughtful, and apparently troubled by the obvious nature of the trafficking situation. He would often talk to me like I was a real person rather than a service provider, asking about my background and expressing what seemed like genuine concern for my welfare. These conversations with Thomas gave me insight into the psychology of men who participated in trafficking while maintaining some awareness of its reality. He knew I was being held against my will, knew that his participation was funding criminal activity, but he had constructed elaborate mental justifications for continuing to request me. He told himself he was being kind to me, that his monthly visits were better for me than serving rougher clients, that he was somehow protecting me within an unavoidable situation. The cognitive dissonance was fascinating and disturbing. Thomas would express concern about my welfare in one breath, and then proceed to rape me in the next. Apparently seeing no contradiction between these actions, he represented a category of trafficking customers who acknowledged the reality of the situation, while refusing to accept responsibility for their role in perpetuating it. Through Thomas and other clients, I learned about the broader network that supported high-end trafficking operations. There were legitimate businesses that served as fronts, corrupt officials who provided protection, and professional services that helped move money and people across jurisdictions. The infrastructure was vast and sophisticated, involving hundreds of people who enabled the trafficking trade, while maintaining plausible deniability about their participation. Spring brought another relocation, this time to a facility in New Mexico that served clients from Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. The constant movement served multiple purposes. It prevented us from forming strong connections with each other, kept us disoriented and dependent, and made it harder for law enforcement to track operations. Each new location meant learning new routines, new supervisors, and new client expectations. The New Mexico facility was the most isolated yet, located on what appeared to be an abandoned ranch dozens of miles from the nearest town. The buildings were older and more run down, but the security was even tighter than previous locations. Guard dogs patrolled the perimeter at night, and the nearest neighbors were too far away to hear any sounds that might escape the comp. This isolation had a profound effect on the girls held there. With no visual connection to the outside world and no possibility of interaction with anyone beyond our captors and clients, reality began to feel increasingly abstract. Some girls started to dissociate regularly, mentally detaching from their experiences as a survival mechanism. Others became hyper-focused on small details of daily routine, finding meaning and control in things like how they arranged their belongings or scheduled their limited free time. I found myself falling into the second category, becoming obsessive about observing and analyzing everything around me. I memorized guard schedules, counted steps between buildings, cataloged the makes and models of vehicles that came and went. This information served no immediate purpose, but collecting it gave me a sense of agency and kept my mind sharp during a period when intellectual stimulation was otherwise non-existent. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance and control was in some ways more difficult than the physical abuse. Every moment was monitored, every conversation overheard, every emotion scrutinized for signs of resistance or plan. Privacy became a foreign concept when even basic bodily functions were supervised and regulated. The erasure of personal autonomy was systematic and complete, but within this environment of total control, I began to notice cracks in their security protocol. Guards who became complacent during quiet periods, supervisors who cut corners when they thought no one was watching, delivery schedules that created brief windows of reduced surveillance. The human element in any security system eventually reveals weaknesses, and I was desperate enough to notice and catalog every possible vulnerability. My opportunity would come during the chaos of another relocation, but first I had to survive several more months in New Mexico, while gathering the information and building the mental strength I would need for an escape attempt. The psychological challenge of maintaining hope and determination while enduring daily trauma was immense, but the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant spending the rest of my life in this nightmare. The clients in New Mexico were different again, rougher, less sophisticated, paying less money but demanding more extreme services. The downgrade reflected the remote location and lower operational costs, but it also meant higher volumes and more dangerous encounters. Some clients were clearly connected to other criminal enterprises, bringing an additional layer of violence and unpredictability to our situation. Through conversations with these men, I learned about the broader criminal ecosystem that trafficking organizations operated within. Drug cartels, weapons dealers, money launderers, and human traffickers all worked together in overlapping networks that spanned multiple countries and industries. The scope was staggering and explained how these operations could function with such apparent immunity from law enforcement interference. But this knowledge also revealed potential weakness. Complex criminal networks with multiple moving parts and competing interests eventually develop internal conflicts and vulnerabilities. Information was power in these organizations, and information could be weaponized by someone clever enough to understand the relationships and motivated enough to exploit them. As spring turned to summer in New Mexico, I began to sense changes in the operation that suggested either expansion or preparation for major movements. More girls arrived from other locations, guard rotations increased, and supervisory staff held frequent meetings that seemed tense and urgent. Something was shifting in their broader operation, creating the kind of disruption that might provide cover for an escape attempt. The opportunity came sooner than expected, during what should have been a routine transfer between facilities. They were moving 6 of us from New Mexico to a new location in Arizona, using a convoy of 3 vehicles and minimal security precautions. The overconfidence that comes from months of successful operations had made them sloppy, and sloppiness creates opportunities for people desperate enough to exploit them. I had been planning this moment for weeks, memorizing every detail of previous transfers, and identifying the most likely scenario for escape. The key was timing, waiting for the right combination of circumstances, while being ready to act instantly when they align. In trafficking situations, opportunities for escape are rare and brief, requiring split-second decisions with life or death consequences. The convoy stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by desert that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also freedom. After 8 months in captivity, the prospect of dying free in the desert seemed preferable to living another day in slavery. When my moment came, I took it without hesitation. The guard was distracted, the restraints were loose, and the desert was dark enough to provide cover. I ran into that wasteland with nothing but determination and the survival skills I had absorbed during childhood camping trips with my grandfather. Behind me, I could hear shouting and car engines, but ahead was the possibility of freedom. For 3 days, I survived on instinct and desperation, moving only at night and hiding during the day. Dehydration and exposure pushed my body to its limits, but my mind remained focused on the single goal of reaching civilization and finding help. Every step was a choice between surrender and survival, and I chose survival every time. When the Border Patrol agent found me collapsed beside a highway, I was barely conscious but still alive, free for the first time in 8 months, though the journey back to humanity would prove to be longer and more complex than the escape itself. The girl who had been sold for $200,000 was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival sometimes requires becoming a different person entirely. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and industrial laundry, a sterile cocoon that felt simultaneously safe and alien after months in captivity. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead while machines beeped softly, monitoring vital signs that confirmed I was alive despite feeling disconnected from my own body. The Border Patrol agent who had found me sat in a plastic chair beside the bed, his weathered face creased with concern as he explained what would happen next. Agent Martinez spoke in careful, measured tones about protocols and procedures, but his eyes held genuine compassion that I hadn't seen in an adult's face for almost a year. He had called the FBI the moment my story became coherent enough to understand, and federal agents specializing in human trafficking were already driving from El Paso to interview me. The wheels of law enforcement were turning, but slowly, like machinery that hadn't been used in a while. Dr. Chen, the physician overseeing my care, explained my physical condition with clinical precision softened by obvious anger at what had been done to me. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and exposure damage from my desert escape were compounded by months of systematic abuse and neglect. My body would heal relatively quickly with proper care, she assured me, but the psychological trauma would require specialist attention and possibly years of therapy. The FBI agents arrived on my second day in the hospital, introducing themselves as Special Agent Maria Santos and Special Agent David Park from the Human Trafficking Task Force. Agent Santos was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested extensive experience with cases like mine. Agent Park was younger, maybe early 30s, and seemed to approach the interview with the careful intensity of someone who took these crimes personally. They explained their process with patience I hadn't expected from federal law enforcement. My account would be recorded and corroborated through multiple interviews conducted over several days. They would need detailed descriptions of locations, people, procedures, and anything else that might help them identify and prosecute the trafficking network. The investigation would be thorough and potentially dangerous for me, requiring entry into witness protection for my safety. Agent Santos started with basic questions about my background and family situation, establishing a timeline that led to my trafficking. She listened without judgment as I described my parents' financial crisis, the fake family vacation, and the business meeting that became my delivery to Patricia's organization. Her expression grew harder as I explained how my father had personally negotiated my sale and signed documents, transferring ownership of me to traffickers. The legal implications of my parents' involvement were complex and troubling. Agent Santos explained that they had committed serious federal crimes by participating in human trafficking, regardless of their motivations or the threats they faced. The evidence I could provide would likely be sufficient for prosecution, but the decision about whether to pursue charges would depend partly on my cooperation and preferences as the victim. This conversation forced me to confront questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Did I want my parents prosecuted for selling me into slavery? Could I live with myself if they went to prison because of my testimony? Did seeking justice for my trauma require destroying what remained of my family? The agents gave me time to process these dilemmas, but they also made clear that my testimony would be crucial for dismantling the broader trafficking network. Over the following days, I provided detailed accounts of every location where I had been held, every supervisor and guard I could remember, and every client whose face or name I could recall. Agent Park took notes while Agent Santos asked follow-up questions that helped establish patterns and connections within the criminal organization. The process was exhausting but also empowering, transforming my traumatic memories into weapons against the people who had caused them. The descriptions of Patricia's operation revealed the sophisticated nature of modern human trafficking enterprises. These weren't crude criminal gangs operating from abandoned warehouses. They were business organizations with complex supply chains, customer management systems, and operational security protocols. The agents explained that dismantling such networks required extensive investigation and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Agent Santos showed me photographs of known trafficking suspects, asking if I recognized any faces from my time in captivity. Several photos matched people I remembered, providing confirmation that my captors were part of a larger network already under federal investigation. My testimony would add crucial details to cases that had been building for months or years, potentially providing the evidence needed for successful prosecutions. The witness protection process began before I was even released from the hospital. Social workers explained how my identity would be changed, my background documented, and my transition to freedom managed. I would receive a new social security number, driver's license, and birth certificate with a different name and modified personal history. The girl named Angela Davis would officially disappear, replaced by someone with a clean slate and government protection. Choosing a new identity felt surreal and symbolic. The agents suggested names that would be easy to remember while providing distance from my past, eventually settling on Jennifer Walsh as my new legal identity. Jennifer was close enough to my real name to avoid confusion, but different enough to provide psychological separation from my trauma. Walsh was common enough to blend in anywhere but distinctive enough to remember clearly. The safe house where I would begin my new life was a modest apartment in a Denver suburb, chosen for its distance from trafficking networks and proximity to specialized support services. Federal marshals would provide security during the transition period, while therapists and social workers would help me adjust to freedom after months of captivity. The support system was comprehensive but temporary. Ultimately, I would need to build an independent life as Jennifer Walsh. Moving into the safe house felt like entering another kind of prison, albeit a comfortable one. Every window had reinforced glass and security sensors, while unmarked federal vehicles maintained constant surveillance of the surrounding area. My movements were restricted and monitored, my communications filtered through law enforcement protocols. Freedom was relative when safety required such extensive precautions. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the trauma specialist assigned to my case, began therapy sessions immediately upon my arrival in Denver. She specialized in helping trafficking survivors process their experiences and rebuild their capacity for normal relationships and daily functioning. The work was intense and often painful, requiring me to revisit traumatic memories while learning coping strategies for managing their ongoing effects. The early therapy sessions focused on basic psychological stabilization, helping me sleep without nightmares, eat regular meals, and interact with other people without panic attacks. Rodriguez explained that trafficking trauma involved multiple layers of abuse: physical, sexual, psychological, and social. Each layer required different therapeutic approaches and would heal at its own pace. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was learning to trust my own perceptions and judgment again. Months of systematic manipulation and gaslighting had undermined my confidence in my ability to assess people and situations accurately. Every interaction felt potentially dangerous. Every kindness seemed like a possible trap. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that hypervigilance was a normal response to trauma, but could become problematic if it prevented me from forming healthy relationships. The federal investigation accelerated during my first month in Denver, with agents conducting raids on several trafficking locations based on information I had provided. The raids yielded mixed results. They rescued 8 girls from facilities in Texas and Arizona, but found that the main operational centers had been abandoned shortly after my escape. Patricia and her senior associates had vanished, taking most of their records and assets with them. Agent Santos updated me regularly on the investigation's progress, balancing the need to keep me informed with concerns about my emotional stability. The raids had disrupted the network's operations, but hadn't dismantled it completely. Several low-level operatives were arrested and charged, but the leadership had escaped along with most of their financial resources. This meant the threat to my safety remained significant and indefinite. The revelation that my escape had triggered widespread changes in their operations brought complicated emotions. Relief that other girls had been rescued was mixed with guilt that my actions might have led to harsher treatment for those who remained in captivity. Rodriguez helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for decisions made by criminals, but survivors' guilt remained a persistent challenge throughout my recovery. Meanwhile, the question of my parents' prosecution loomed over every conversation with federal agents. Evidence of their involvement was clear and extensive: recorded phone calls, signed documents, and witness testimony painted an undeniable picture of their participation in trafficking me. Agent Santos explained that they could face 25 years in federal prison if convicted, essentially life sentences given their ages and health conditions. The weight of this decision was crushing. Part of me wanted them to face consequences for the choice they had made, for the trauma they had caused, for the year of my life they had stolen. But another part remembered that they were also victims of the same criminal organization that had enslaved me, trapped by impossible circumstances and manipulated into making an unthinkable choice. Dr. Rodriguez helped me explore these conflicted feelings without pushing me toward any particular decision. She explained that justice could take many forms and that my healing didn't necessarily require my parents' punishment. The choice about their prosecution was mine to make, but it should be based on what would best support my long-term recovery, rather than immediate emotional reactions. During my 3rd month in Denver, I received news that Marcus had been asking questions about my disappearance. My parents had maintained the fiction that I had decided to stay in Las Vegas for work opportunities, but Marcus was becoming suspicious about my lack of communication. Federal agents were monitoring the situation to ensure that my brother's inquiries didn't compromise my safety or the ongoing investigation. The possibility of contact with Marcus created intense emotional conflict. I desperately wanted to let him know I was alive and safe, but doing so would expose my location and potentially endanger both of us. Agent Santos explained that any communication with my family would need to wait until the trafficking network was completely dismantled or I was permanently relocated beyond their reach. This isolation from my brother was particularly painful because Marcus had played no role in my trafficking and was suffering unnecessarily from uncertainty about my fate. He was finishing his senior year of high school without understanding why his sister had abandoned the family, believing lies that portrayed me as selfish and uncaring. The injustice of his situation added another layer of guilt to my recovery process. As spring turned to summer in Denver, I began making remarkable progress in therapy while struggling with the limitations of witness protection. Dr. Rodriguez noted significant improvements in my sleeping patterns, anxiety levels, and social interaction. I was beginning to envision a future beyond mere survival, though the shape of that future remained unclear, given the constraints of my situation. The decision to pursue education as Jennifer Walsh came gradually, emerging from therapy sessions about rebuilding identity and purpose after trauma. I had always been academically inclined, and learning provided both intellectual stimulation and emotional grounding during my recovery. Community college classes would allow me to begin rebuilding my life while maintaining the low profile required for safety. Enrolling at Front Range Community College under my new identity felt like a symbolic rebirth. The registration process required extensive documentation that federal marshals had prepared, creating an educational history for Jennifer Walsh that would support her admission to college program. My academic transcripts had been modified to reflect the new identity while preserving my actual educational achievements. The first day of classes was terrifying and exhilarating simultaneously. Sitting in a lecture hall surrounded by other students my age, taking notes and participating in discussions, felt almost impossibly normal after everything I had experienced. The simple act of raising my hand to ask a question seemed like a miracle of freedom and agency. My initial course load focused on general education requirements, while I explored potential majors that might support my long-term goals. Psychology classes helped me understand my own trauma while developing empathy for other survivors. Business courses provided practical skills that might enable financial independence. Computer science offered technical knowledge that could prove valuable in an increasingly digital world. The social aspects of college were more challenging than the academic work. Forming friendships required navigating the constant need to maintain my cover story while avoiding topics that might reveal my true background. Dating was impossible when any romantic relationship would require lies about my past and might compromise my safety. The isolation was self-imposed but necessary for survival. Professor Michael Thompson, who taught my Introduction to Business course, became an unexpected mentor during this period. He noticed my intense focus and sophisticated understanding of organizational structures, encouraging me to consider advanced studies in business administration. Our conversations about entrepreneurship and social impact planted seeds for ideas that would later become central to my life's work. The federal investigation reached a crucial turning point during my second semester at Front Range. Agent Santos called to inform me that Patricia had been arrested in Mexico and was being extradited to face trafficking charges in the United States. Her capture had been facilitated by intelligence gathered from my testimony, making me a key witness in what would likely be a high-profile prosecution. Patricia's arrest brought mixed emotions: satisfaction that she would finally face justice, but also terror about testifying against someone who had demonstrated such capacity for violence and revenge. Agent Santos assured me that my safety would be the top priority during any legal proceedings, but we both understood that testifying would significantly increase my risk profile for the foreseeable future. The prospect of facing Patricia in court forced me to confront how much I had changed since my escape. The frightened 18-year-old girl who had been sold into slavery was gone, replaced by someone who understood that justice sometimes required courage in the face of danger. Dr. Rodriguez helped me prepare psychologically for testimony that would require reliving traumatic experiences while maintaining composure under intense scrutiny. During this same period, I learned that my parents were also facing federal investigation for their role in my trafficking. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and prosecutors were preparing charges that could result in life sentences for both of them. Agent Santos asked again whether I wanted to influence the prosecution decisions, making it clear that my preferences would carry significant weight with the federal attorneys handling the case. The complexity of these decisions was overwhelming. Testifying against Patricia felt like an obvious choice. She was a career criminal who had destroyed countless lives and deserved maximum punishment. But testifying against my parents required confronting my own feelings about family, forgiveness, and the nature of justice itself. Marcus's situation added another layer of complexity to my decision-making. He was now 18 and would be starting college in the fall, still believing that I had abandoned the family for selfish reasons. If our parents were arrested and prosecuted, he would learn the truth about my disappearance, but would also lose any remaining family support during a crucial transition period in his life. Dr. Rodriguez suggested that my feelings about family prosecution might evolve as my recovery progressed, and that I shouldn't feel pressured to make permanent decisions while still processing trauma. The federal agents were willing to delay charging my parents while the case against Patricia moved forward, giving me time to consider what form of justice would best serve my healing and protection. The summer before Patricia's trial was intensive preparation for what prosecutors warned would be a brutal legal battle. Her defense team would likely attempt to discredit my testimony by highlighting my family's financial motivations, suggesting that I was a willing participant who later fabricated trafficking claims. Agent Santos helped me prepare for these attacks while ensuring that I understood my rights and protections as a victim and witness. The psychological preparation for testifying was as important as the legal preparation. Rodriguez worked with me on techniques for managing anxiety and maintaining emotional control while describing traumatic experiences to a courtroom full of strangers. We practiced testimony until I could discuss my trafficking experience with clinical detachment, protecting my emotional well-being while ensuring that jurors understood the reality of what had happened to me. As fall approached and Patricia's trial date drew near, I made a decision that surprised everyone involved in my case. I wanted to testify not just about my own trafficking experience, but about the broader pattern of how organizations like Patricia's targeted and manipulated vulnerable families. My parents' involvement was part of a systematic exploitation strategy that these networks used against desperate people facing impossible choices. This decision meant acknowledging my parents' crimes while also contextualizing them within the larger criminal enterprise that had manipulated. It was a nuanced position that required careful legal and psychological preparation, but it felt like the most honest and just approach to the complex reality of my situation. Agent Santos explained that this testimony strategy could potentially help other families who had been similarly manipulated, while also supporting prosecutions of the trafficking network's leadership. It would require me to be vulnerable about my family's circumstances while maintaining focus on the criminal organization that had exploited those circumstances for profit. The approaching trial represented both an opportunity for justice and a test of how much I had healed from my trafficking experience. Facing Patricia across a courtroom would require confronting the person who had orchestrated my enslavement while demonstrating to myself and others that I had survived and grown stronger from my ordeal. As Jennifer Walsh, I was building a new life based on education, purpose, and carefully maintained relationships. But as Angela Davis, I still had unfinished business with the people who had stolen a year of my life and tried to break my spirit. The trial would determine whether justice was possible for trafficking survivors, and whether families like mine could find redemption after making choices that seemed unforgivable. The federal courthouse in Denver loomed like a monument to justice, its granite facade and towering columns designed to inspire confidence in the legal system's ability to deliver fairness. Walking through the security checkpoints with Agent Santos, I felt the weight of 18 months of preparation converging into this single moment. Patricia Williams sat somewhere inside this building preparing to face charges that could result in life imprisonment, and my testimony would be crucial in determining whether justice would finally be served. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Chen, had transformed my traumatic experiences into a comprehensive legal strategy designed to expose the full scope of Patricia's trafficking operation. Over dozens of preparation sessions, they had helped me organize my memories into chronological evidence that would paint a clear picture of systematic exploitation spanning multiple states and involving hundreds of victims over several years. District Attorney Chen explained that Patricia's defense team would attempt to portray trafficking victims as willing participants who later fabricated abuse claims for immigration benefits or financial compensation. This strategy relied on public misconceptions about trafficking, particularly the false belief that victims could simply leave their situations if they truly wanted freedom. My education and middle-class background would be used to suggest that I had voluntarily entered prostitution and invented the trafficking narrative afterward. The courtroom itself was smaller than I had expected from television dramas, with wooden benches arranged theater-style facing the judge's elevated platform. Federal marshals positioned themselves strategically throughout the space, their presence a reminder that Patricia remained dangerous even in custody. When she entered in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, flanked by her defense attorneys, I was struck by how ordinary she appeared compared to the monster I had built up in my memory. Patricia's eyes found mine across the courtroom during the opening statements, and for a moment I was transported back to that hotel suite in Las Vegas where my nightmare had begun. But the fear that had once paralyzed me was now tempered by 2 years of therapy, education, and careful rebuilding of my sense of self. I met her gaze steadily, no longer the terrified 18-year-old she had last seen begging for freedom in a basement cell. Assistant U. Attorney Chen's opening statement laid out the government's case with methodical precision, describing a criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars through the systematic enslavement of young women recruited through family manipulation and false promises. She explained how Patricia's organization specifically targeted families in financial crisis, offering them an impossible choice between losing everything or sacrificing one child to save the rest. The defense's opening statement, delivered by attorney Marcus Wheeler, attempted to reframe the entire case as a misunderstanding between adults engaged in voluntary commercial relationships. Wheeler argued that no one had been forced to do anything against their will, and that the so-called victims were actually young women who had made poor choices and later regretted them. His strategy was to blame the victims while portraying Patricia as a businesswoman operating in a legal gray area. My testimony began on the trial's third day, after prosecutors had established the legal framework and presented evidence about Patricia's broader criminal enterprise. The walk from the witness waiting room to the courtroom felt endless, each step carrying the weight of every girl who had suffered in Patricia's compounds and every family that had been torn apart by her manipulation tactics. Prosecutor Chen began with basic questions about my background and family situation, establishing the context that led to my trafficking. I described our life in Bakersfield, my father's struggling auto repair business, and the mounting financial pressures that made my parents vulnerable to Patricia's recruitment approach. The jury listened intently as I explained how ordinary financial stress could escalate into desperation that criminals knew how to exploit. Describing the fake family vacation and business meeting required me to relive some of my most painful memories. But Dr. Rodriguez's preparation helped me maintain emotional control while ensuring the jury understood the psychological manipulation involved. I explained how Patricia's team had used my trust in my parents and my excitement about potential opportunities to deliver me willingly into their custody. The details of my captivity were the most difficult part of my testimony, requiring clinical precision while conveying the human impact of systematic abuse. Prosecutor Chen guided me through descriptions of the facilities, the debt bondage system, and the rotation of clients who paid to rape trafficked women. I explained how the financial structure was designed to ensure that victims never earned their freedom, regardless of their compliance or cooperation. Defense attorney Wheeler's cross-examination was aggressive and personally attacking, exactly as Agent Santos had warned me to expect. He questioned my memory of events, suggested that I had voluntarily participated in prostitution, and implied that my trafficking claims were fabricated to avoid taking responsibility for my choices. His strategy was to make me appear unreliable and opportunistic rather than traumatized and exploited. Wheeler focused extensively on my education and background, arguing that someone with my advantages could have escaped if she truly wanted freedom. He seemed to believe that middle-class trafficking victims were inherently less credible than those from more obvious poverty, as if education provided immunity against systematic coercion and violence. His questions revealed the fundamental misunderstanding about trafficking that allowed these crimes to continue flourishing. The most challenging moment came when Wheeler showed photographs of the hotel suite where I had been drugged and kidnapped, suggesting that the luxurious surroundings proved I was a willing participant in some kind of business arrangement. He asked why I hadn't simply left the hotel if I was truly being held against my will, apparently ignorant about how drugging works or how psychological manipulation functions. I answered his questions with the same clinical detachment Rodriguez had taught me, explaining the pharmacological effects of the drugs I had been given and the psychological impact of threats against my family. When he suggested that my parents' financial payment proved I was a willing commodity rather than a trafficking victim, I calmly explained that payment to family members was a standard recruitment tactic used by trafficking organizations to create complicity and prevent rescue attempts. Prosecutor Chen's redirect examination allowed me to clarify points that the defense had tried to confuse and to provide additional context about trafficking operations that the jury needed to understand. I explained how modern trafficking relied more on psychological control than physical restraints, and how isolation, debt bondage, and threats against loved ones created prison walls that were invisible but impenetrable. The second day of my testimony focused on the broader patterns I had observed during my captivity, describing how Patricia's organization recruited other victims and managed operations across multiple states. I provided details about the sophisticated business structure, the security protocols, and the customer management systems that allowed the enterprise to function with minimal law enforcement interference. Defense attorney Wheeler attempted to discredit this testimony by suggesting that I couldn't have understood the business operations as a victim, but his questions actually strengthened the prosecution's case. My detailed knowledge of their financial systems and operational procedures demonstrated the systematic nature of my exploitation and contradicted his claims that I was merely a voluntary participant in commercial activity. The emotional impact of testifying was exhausting but also empowering in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each question answered was another small victory over the people who had tried to break my spirit and erase my identity. The formal legal setting provided a framework for transforming my trauma into evidence that could prevent future crimes and deliver justice for past ones. Other witnesses followed my testimony, including FBI agents who described the investigation and raids, experts who explained trafficking operations, and other survivors who corroborated patterns of abuse and exploitation. The prosecution built a comprehensive case that portrayed Patricia as the leader of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, rather than a misunderstood businesswoman operating in legal gray area. Patricia's defense team called several character witnesses who described her community involvement and charitable activities, attempting to create reasonable doubt about her criminal intention. They portrayed her as someone who had been misled by subordinates, or who had operated legitimate businesses that were later mischaracterized by disgruntled employees, seeking attention or compensation. The defense's strategy was undermined by the extensive physical evidence prosecutors had gathered, including financial records showing payments to families, surveillance footage from trafficking locations, and communications between organization members discussing recruitment and management of victims. Patricia's own recorded conversations revealed her awareness of the criminal nature of her activities and her callous attitude toward the women being exploited. During closing arguments, Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen synthesized weeks of testimony into a compelling narrative about organized crime disguised as business enterprise. She reminded the jury that trafficking was about power and control rather than commercial relationships, and that victims like me had survived to seek justice not just for ourselves, but for the countless others who remained voiceless. Defense attorney Wheeler's closing argument was a desperate attempt to maintain his client's innocence, despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. He continued to blame victims for their situations, while portraying Patricia as someone who had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement agencies, seeking high-profile convictions. His arguments felt hollow and unconvincing after weeks of detailed testimony about systematic abuse and exploitation. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts, including human trafficking, forced labor, and conspiracy charges that carried potential life sentences. When the foreman read the verdicts aloud, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced since my escape from captivity. Justice was possible, even in cases where the criminals seemed untouchable and the system appeared stacked against survivors. Patricia's sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements from survivors who had been trafficked by her organization. I chose to deliver my statement in person, wanting to look Patricia in the eye one final time while explaining how her crimes had impacted not just me but my entire family and countless other people whose lives had been shattered by her grief. Standing at the podium in that federal courtroom, addressing the judge while Patricia sat just feet away, I felt the completion of a journey that had begun in a basement cell in Texas. The frightened teenager who had been sold into slavery was gone, replaced by someone who understood that survival required more than just escape. it demanded the courage to seek justice and prevent future crime. My victim impact statement described not just the physical and psychological trauma of trafficking, but the broader social damage caused by organizations that turned families against each other and destroyed communities' ability to trust and protect their most vulnerable members. I explained how Patricia's crimes had ripple effects that extended far beyond her direct victims, poisoning relationships and institutions that were supposed to provide safety and support. The judge sentenced Patricia to life in prison without possibility of parole, citing the systematic nature of her crimes and the extensive harm caused to victims and their families. The sentence was the maximum allowed under federal guidelines and sent a clear message that trafficking would be prosecuted aggressively when evidence supported conviction. But Patricia's conviction was only part of the justice I saw. The trial had revealed the broader network of individuals and institutions that had enabled her crimes, including corrupt officials, complicit businesses, and customers who had funded the trafficking enterprise through their payments for commercial rape. Many of these enablers would never face legal consequences, but their exposure during the trial had disrupted their operations and damaged their reputations. The weeks following Patricia's sentencing brought a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety about my family's situation. Federal prosecutors had postponed charging my parents while Patricia's trial proceeded, but they were now preparing to move forward with cases against family members who had participated in trafficking their own children. The evidence against my parents was clear and extensive, but my feelings about their prosecution remained complicated. Agent Santos arranged a meeting to discuss my family's situation and my preferences about prosecution decisions. She explained that federal attorneys would consider victim input when determining appropriate charges and sentences, but that my parents' crimes were serious enough to warrant significant punishment regardless of my personal feelings about their prosecution. The conversation forced me to articulate feelings I had been avoiding throughout my recovery process. My parents had committed unforgivable acts that had traumatized me and destroyed our family, but they had also been manipulated by sophisticated criminals who understood exactly how to exploit parental love and desperation. They were both perpetrators and victims, deserving punishment but also worthy of some compassion. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand that seeking nuanced justice didn't mean excusing criminal behavior or minimizing the harm that had been caused. I could acknowledge the complexity of my parents' situation while still insisting on accountability for their choices. The goal was finding a response that would promote healing and prevent future crimes rather than simply punishing past ones. Marcus remained unaware of the true circumstances surrounding my disappearance, still believing the fiction that I had chosen to stay in Las Vegas for work opportunities. He was now in his second year of college, studying social work and volunteering with programs that helped at-risk youth. His career choice seemed like unconscious recognition that our family had failed to protect someone vulnerable, even though he didn't understand the full nature of that failure. The decision about whether to contact Marcus was another complex choice that required balancing his right to know the truth against his need for emotional stability during a crucial period in his development. Agent Santos explained that any contact would require extensive security precautions and might compromise my safety if Patricia's organization was still monitoring my family for revenge opportunity. During this period of decision-making about family prosecution and contact, I received news that would fundamentally change my perspective on justice and redemption. Agent Santos called to inform me that my parents had been arrested on unrelated drug trafficking charges stemming from their desperate attempts to save their business and avoid bankruptcy after my disappearance. The irony was devastating and illuminating. In their grief and guilt over losing me, my parents had made additional criminal choices that led to their downfall. They had been running drugs through the auto repair shop, using their legitimate business as a front for moving narcotics between California and Nevada. The operation had been detected during an investigation unrelated to my trafficking case, but the timing suggested that their criminal escalation was connected to their trauma over selling. Marcus had been placed in foster care when my parents were arrested, and the full truth about my disappearance had been revealed during the investigation. He learned simultaneously that I was alive, that our parents had sold me to traffickers, and that they were now facing federal charges for multiple crimes. The psychological impact of these revelations had been severe enough to require psychiatric hospitalization. Agent Santos arranged for me to fly to California under heavy security to visit Marcus in the treatment facility where he was recovering from his breakdown. The reunion was emotional and complicated, filled with tears of relief that I was alive, mixed with anger at the deceptions that had shaped his life for the past 3 years. He struggled to understand how our parents could have made such choices, and how I could have survived such experience. Marcus was furious with our parents in ways that I had never been, perhaps because his trauma was fresher or because he hadn't had years of therapy to process the complexity of their situation. He wanted them to face maximum punishment for their crimes, and refused to consider any factors that might mitigate their culpability. His anger was pure and uncomplicated in ways that mine could no longer be. Our conversations over several days revealed how differently we had been affected by our family's destruction. Marcus felt betrayed not just by our parents' decision to traffic me, but by the years of lies that followed. He had mourned a sister who was actually fighting for survival, had blamed himself for somehow causing my disappearance, and had built his identity around being the surviving child who had to justify his parents' love. I tried to explain how therapy had helped me understand our parents as complex people who had made terrible choices under impossible circumstances, rather than monsters who had coldly calculated my destruction. But Marcus wasn't ready for that level of nuance. His emotional processing was years behind mine, and he needed time to experience and work through his initial feelings before he could consider forgiveness or complexity. The visit with Marcus clarified my thinking about justice and family in ways that months of therapy hadn't accomplished. Seeing his fresh trauma reminded me of my own journey from rage to understanding, and helped me recognize that justice could take many forms depending on where people were in their healing process. Marcus needed our parents to face consequences for their choices, while I needed them to have opportunities for redemption and relationship repair. Returning to Denver after visiting Marcus, I made a decision that surprised everyone involved in my case, including myself. I was going to advocate for prosecutorial mercy for my parents, while also providing full cooperation for their prosecution on drug trafficking charges. The distinction was important. I wanted them held accountable for their criminal choices, but I also wanted the justice system to recognize the context that had shaped those choices. Agent Santos helped me draft a letter to federal prosecutors, explaining my position and requesting consideration of my family's circumstances when determining appropriate charges and sentences. The letter acknowledged my parents' crimes while arguing that their trafficking of me was part of a broader pattern of victimization by professional criminals who had systematically exploited their desperation. I asked prosecutors to consider sentences that would allow my parents eventual opportunities for family reunification and community reintegration, rather than punishment designed solely for retribution. Not because their crimes weren't serious, but because breaking families apart was exactly what trafficking organizations intended to accomplish, and perpetuating that destruction served their interest rather than just. The letter was the most difficult document I had ever written, requiring me to set aside my own trauma to consider what response would best serve healing and prevention, rather than simple punishment. I wasn't advocating for my parents because I had forgiven them or wanted to resume normal family relationships. I was advocating for justice that would strengthen communities, rather than further fragmenting. Writing that letter forced me to articulate a philosophy of justice that I hadn't fully understood before attempting to express it. True justice needed to address the systematic conditions that created opportunities for trafficking rather than simply punishing individual participants after crimes had already occurred. Breaking the cycle required responses that rebuilt rather than destroyed, that created accountability without eliminating hope for redemption. The federal prosecutors agreed to consider my recommendations when negotiating plea agreements with my parents, though they made clear that significant sentences would still be necessary given the severity of their crime. The compromise position involved guilty pleas to reduced charges that would result in 10 to 12 years in federal prison, rather than the life sentences they could have faced if prosecuted for trafficking. Marcus was furious when he learned about my advocacy for prosecutorial mercy, feeling that I was betraying him by helping the people who had destroyed our family. He couldn't understand how I could separate accountability from punishment, or how I could work toward family preservation after experiencing family betrayal. Our different perspectives created tension that would require years of patient conversation to resolve. But my decision felt right in ways that pure revenge never could have. The girl who had been sold for $200,000 was gone, replaced by someone who understood that healing sometimes required choosing reconstruction over retribution. I had survived trafficking, built a new life, and chosen mercy over vengeance, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let trauma make you into someone you don't want to be. The transition from Jennifer Walsh back to Angela Davis happened gradually over the course of 2 years, as federal marshals determined that Patricia's network had been sufficiently disrupted to reduce the immediate threat to my safety. The Witness Protection Program had served its purpose, allowing me to heal and build strength while the legal system processed the complex criminal cases stemming from my trafficking experience. But living under an assumed identity had its own psychological costs, and I was ready to reclaim my authentic self. Moving back to my original name felt like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit. 3 years of trauma, recovery, and growth had fundamentally changed who I was, making the person I had been before trafficking feel like a stranger from someone else's life. Angela Davis at 21 was harder, wiser, and more focused than the 18-year-old who had trusted her parents to protect her during a family vacation to Las Vegas. Rodriguez helped me navigate this identity transition while maintaining the therapeutic progress I had achieved during my time as Jennifer Walsh. The psychological work of integrating my pre-trafficking self with the person I had become required careful attention to avoiding either idealization of my past innocence or rejection of my current wisdom. Both versions of myself were authentic and valuable, representing different stages of a continuous journey toward wholeness. The decision to pursue higher education accelerated during this transition period, driven by my growing understanding that knowledge was power and that power could be used to prevent the crimes I had survived. Front Range Community College had provided a foundation, but I needed advanced education to build the kind of organization that could systematically fight trafficking networks, rather than simply responding to individual cases after damage had already been done. Transferring to the University of Colorado in Boulder as Angela Davis required extensive coordination with federal agencies to ensure my academic records accurately reflected my achievements while protecting information that might compromise my safety. The process was complicated but ultimately successful, allowing me to pursue a double major in business administration and computer science that would provide the technical and organizational skills needed for my emerging vision. The university environment presented both opportunities and challenges for someone with my background. Academic coursework felt manageable after everything I had survived, but social interactions remained complicated by the need to carefully manage information about my past while building genuine relationships with classmates and professors. I had learned to compartmentalize effectively, but the constant vigilance required for maintaining operational security was exhausting. Professor David Kim in the computer science department became an important mentor during my junior year, recognizing my unusual combination of technical aptitude and sophisticated understanding of criminal organization. He encouraged me to focus my senior project on developing technological solutions for law enforcement challenges, not knowing the personal motivation behind my interest in systems that could track and disrupt organized crime networks. The technology platform I developed for my senior thesis was ostensibly designed to help law enforcement agencies coordinate information sharing and resource allocation during complex investigations. But the underlying architecture was specifically optimized for tracking human trafficking operations, with features that could map financial flows, identify recruitment patterns, and predict operational vulnerabilities in criminal networks. Professor Kim was impressed enough with my work to suggest that I consider graduate school or potentially commercializing the technology through university incubation programs. His enthusiasm was validating, but I had already decided that my future lay in building an organization dedicated specifically to fighting trafficking rather than pursuing traditional academic or corporate careers. Marcus and I had maintained sporadic contact during my university years, our relationship slowly healing as he processed his own trauma and began to understand the complexity of our family's situation. He had completed his social work degree and was working with at-risk youth in Los Angeles, channeling his anger about our parents' choices into efforts to protect other vulnerable young people from exploitation and abuse. Our conversations had evolved from mutual support during crisis to genuine friendship based on shared commitment to preventing the kinds of systemic failures that had destroyed our family. Marcus had developed his own perspective on justice and healing, one that was less forgiving than mine, but equally focused on practical solutions rather than abstract philosophical concepts. The question of contact with our parents remained a source of tension between us. They were now in their 4th year of federal incarceration, and I had been visiting them twice yearly while Marcus maintained his position that they were dead to him. Neither approach was right or wrong, but our different choices reflected our different paths through trauma recovery and our different relationships with forgiveness and accountability. My visits with our parents were awkward and painful, marked by their obvious guilt and my own conflicted feelings about family loyalty versus personal boundaries. They had aged dramatically during imprisonment, looking older and more fragile than their actual years. My father cried during every visit, repeatedly apologizing for choices that couldn't be undone. My mother was harder, more defensive, but also more interested in understanding how I had survived and what I was building from my experience. These conversations with my parents provided insights into the psychology of people who make unthinkable choices under extreme pressure. They weren't monsters, though their choices had been monstrous. They were ordinary people who had been systematically manipulated by professional criminals and had responded to impossible circumstances with decisions that destroyed their family while failing to solve their problem. Understanding their psychology didn't excuse their actions or minimize the trauma they had caused, but it did inform my thinking about prevention strategies and intervention approaches. The most effective anti-trafficking efforts would need to address the desperation that made families vulnerable to recruitment, rather than simply prosecuting individuals after crimes had already occurred. During my senior year at UC Boulder, I began developing a comprehensive business plan for an organization that would combine technology, education, and direct services to fight human trafficking more effectively than existing approaches. The model integrated lessons learned from my own experience with research about successful intervention strategies and innovative applications of emerging technologies. The organization I envisioned would operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Technology platforms would help law enforcement agencies track and disrupt trafficking networks while providing survivors with access to resources and support services. Educational programs would train professionals to recognize trafficking situations and provide community education about recruitment tactics and warning signs. Direct services would offer comprehensive support for survivors while they rebuilt their lives and pursued justice. Funding for such an ambitious organization would require a combination of government grants, private donations, and potentially revenue from technology licensing to law enforcement agencies. The business model needed to be sustainable and scalable while maintaining focus on mission rather than profit maximization. I spent months researching successful social enterprises and developing financial projections that could support the comprehensive approach I believed was necessary. The breakthrough moment came during a presentation to potential investors and supporters that I organized through UC Boulder's entrepreneurship program. The audience included successful business leaders, foundation executives, and former law enforcement officials who understood the scope and complexity of trafficking networks. My presentation focused on the gaps in current anti-trafficking efforts and the potential for technology-enabled solutions to address those gaps more effectively. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees expressing immediate interest in supporting the organization both financially and strategically. More importantly, the feedback helped me refine my understanding of what would be required to build sustainable impact, rather than simply creating another well-intentioned nonprofit with limited reach and effectiveness. Agent Maria Santos, who had remained a supportive contact throughout my recovery and education, introduced me to retired FBI supervisors and other former law enforcement officials who could provide expertise and credibility for the organization I was building. Their involvement would be crucial for establishing relationships with active law enforcement agencies and ensuring that our technology development aligned with actual operational needs, rather than theoretical possibility. The legal framework for establishing the organization required careful attention to maintaining my security while enabling public fundraising and operation. Federal attorneys helped me navigate the process of creating a public profile that would support organizational credibility without compromising my safety or exposing details that might help trafficking networks identify and target me. By graduation, I had secured initial funding commitments of nearly $2 million from a combination of foundations, individual donors, and government agencies interested in supporting innovative anti-trafficking approaches. The amount was sufficient to hire initial staff, lease office space, and begin developing the technology platforms that would form the core of our service delivery model. Choosing Denver as our headquarters location reflected both practical and personal consideration. The city offered access to technology talent, proximity to federal agencies, and reasonable operating costs compared to coastal alternatives. More personally, Denver had become home during my recovery process, and building the organization there felt like completing a circle that had begun when I first arrived as a traumatized trafficking survivor seeking safety and healing. The first year of operations focused on team building and technology development, gradually expanding from just me to a staff of 12 people with expertise in software development, law enforcement, victim services, and organizational management. Every hire was someone who understood our mission personally, either through their own experiences with trauma or through professional commitment to fighting exploitation and abuse. Sarah Martinez, our first victim services coordinator, was herself a trafficking survivor who had spent 5 years rebuilding her life before deciding to help other women navigate similar journeys. Her presence on our team provided credibility with survivor communities and insights into service delivery approaches that would actually meet the needs of people recovering from trafficking trauma. Detective Rebecca Torres, recently retired from the Denver Police Department's Human Trafficking Unit, joined as our law enforcement liaison and training coordinator. Her 20-year career in investigating trafficking cases provided practical knowledge about how our technology could best support active investigations while avoiding interference with ongoing operations. The technology development process required months of iterative design and testing, working closely with law enforcement partners to ensure that our platforms actually addressed real operational challenges rather than theoretical problems. The resulting software suite included secure information sharing tools, data analysis capabilities for identifying trafficking patterns, and resource coordination systems that could help agencies collaborate more effectively across jurisdictions. Our first major success came when the Colorado Attorney General's office adopted our technology for coordinating anti-trafficking investigations across the state. The implementation revealed several trafficking networks that had previously operated undetected, leading to arrests and rescues that validated our approach and attracted attention from other law enforcement agents. Word about our work spread through professional networks, leading to requests for technology licensing and training services from agencies in other states. Within 18 months of launching, we were working with law enforcement organizations in 15 states and had helped identify and disrupt trafficking operations that had enslaved over 50 people. But the most meaningful aspect of our work was the direct services we provided to trafficking survivors, helping them navigate recovery processes that I understood from personal experience. Our Survivor Services program offered comprehensive support including housing assistance, legal advocacy, education funding, and job placement help that addressed the complex needs of people rebuilding their lives after exploitation. Each survivor we helped represented a personal victory against the networks that had tried to break my spirit and erase my identity. Every success story was evidence that recovery was possible and that trauma could be transformed into strength and purpose. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling in ways that no other career could have provided. The financial success of our organization exceeded all projections, with technology licensing generating revenue that supported expansion of direct services and educational programs. Within 3 years, we were operating with an annual budget of $8 million and had helped rescue over 300 trafficking victims, while training thousands of professionals to recognize and respond to trafficking situations. My personal wealth grew alongside the organization's success, as equity in our social enterprise appreciated and speaking fees for my presentations provided additional income. By my 25th birthday, I was earning more money annually than my parents had ever dreamed of, all of it coming from fighting the same criminal networks that had once enslaved me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now wealthy enough to buy my own freedom many times over, using profits generated by helping other people escape situations similar to what I had survived. Every deposit in my bank account felt like another small victory against Patricia and everyone else who had tried to reduce me to a commodity worth $200,000. Marcus and I had grown closer as our respective careers developed, bonding over our shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people even though we approached the work differently. He focused on prevention through social services and community support, while I concentrated on disruption through technology and law enforcement collaboration. Together, our efforts addressed different aspects of the same underlying problem. The question of our parents' eventual release from federal prison had become more pressing as they entered their final years of incarceration. They would be eligible for supervised release within 2 years, and both Marcus and I would need to decide what kind of relationship, if any, we wanted to have with them after their freedom was restored. Marcus remained adamant that he wanted no contact with them, believing that their crimes had permanently severed any family bonds that might have existed. His position was understandable and valid, based on his own needs for healing and boundary setting. I respected his choice while continuing to wrestle with my own feelings about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of family reconstruction. My decision about post-release relationships with our parents was complicated by my financial success and the leverage it provided. I now had the resources to support their reintegration into society if I chose to do so, potentially providing housing, legal assistance, and other practical help that could make the difference between successful reentry and recidivism. The choice wasn't about whether they deserved help. Their crimes had been serious and their victims numerous. But I had learned that justice could take many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful response to trauma was choosing reconstruction over revenge. My parents had been both perpetrators and victims, deserving accountability but also worthy of opportunities for redemption. Rodriguez, who had remained my therapist throughout the transition back to my original identity and the building of my organization, helped me explore these complicated feelings without pushing me toward any particular decision. She reminded me that forgiveness was a process rather than a destination, and that I could choose different types of relationships with my parents without having to resolve all my conflicted emotions about their choices. The decision crystallized during a conversation with Sarah Martinez about her own family relationships after trafficking. She had maintained contact with relatives who had failed to protect her, not because she had forgiven them completely, but because cutting them off entirely would have meant allowing trauma to make permanent decisions about her life. Her perspective helped me understand that maintaining relationships didn't require excusing behavior or pretending that betrayal hadn't occurred. I chose to establish a trust fund that would provide modest financial support for my parents after their release, along with access to therapy services and job placement assistance. The support came with clear boundaries about contact and expectations, designed to help them rebuild their lives without requiring me to resume normal family relationships or pretend that our past could be forgotten. Marcus was initially upset by my decision, feeling that any assistance to our parents minimized the trauma we had both experienced, but over time, he came to understand that my choice reflected my own healing needs, rather than judgment about his different approach. We agreed to disagree about our parents while maintaining our own relationship and shared commitment to protecting other vulnerable people. The financial arrangements for my parents' support were structured to promote accountability and community reintegration rather than simple charity. They would receive modest housing assistance and living expenses contingent on their participation in therapy, community service, and regular reporting to probation officer. The goal was to help them become contributing members of society, while ensuring that their freedom didn't come at the expense of public safety. News of my parents' impending release reached the media through court filings, generating renewed interest in my story and the organization I had built. Several journalists requested interviews about my journey from trafficking victim to successful entrepreneur, focusing particularly on my decision to provide financial support for the people who had sold me into slavery. I agreed to selected interviews with reporters who demonstrated understanding of trafficking issues and commitment to responsible coverage that would educate rather than sensational. The resulting articles helped raise awareness about modern slavery while highlighting the possibility of recovery and the importance of comprehensive support services for survivors. The media attention also brought new donors and supporters to our organization, including several trafficking survivors who had built successful careers and wanted to contribute to our work. The growing network of survivor leaders provided both financial resources and programmatic expertise that strengthened our ability to serve people in crisis, while advocating for policy changes that would address systemic vulnerability. On the 5th anniversary of Patricia's conviction, I received notification that she had died in federal prison from complications related to diabetes and heart disease. The news brought unexpected relief rather than satisfaction. Her death meant that I would never have to worry about her seeking revenge or targeting other members of my family for retribution. Patricia's death also represented the symbolic end of that chapter of my life, allowing me to focus entirely on building rather than looking backward. The organization we had created was now large enough and successful enough to continue growing without my constant involvement, freeing me to consider what the next phase of my life might include. As I approached my 30th birthday, I realized that the scared 18-year-old who had been sold into trafficking was completely gone, replaced by someone who had transformed trauma into purpose and suffering into strength. The journey from victim to survivor to leader had taken over a decade, but each stage had been necessary for building the knowledge, skills, and emotional resilience required for the work I was doing. My parents were released from federal prison 2 months before my birthday, entering a halfway house in Los Angeles where they would complete their supervised reentry process. I chose not to attend their release, but I did send a letter explaining the support system I had established and my expectations for their behavior moving forward. The letter was cordial but clear about boundaries, expressing hope for their successful reintegration while making no promises about future relationships. I wanted them to understand that my assistance came from a position of strength rather than weakness, and that my choices about family contact would be based on my own needs rather than their desires or expectations. Marcus and I attended a conference for trafficking survivors and service providers that fall, presenting together about sibling relationships and family healing after trauma. Our different approaches to forgiveness and family contact provided useful examples for other survivors struggling with similar decisions about maintaining or severing relationships with people who had failed to protect them. The conference was personally meaningful because it demonstrated how far both Marcus and I had traveled from the confused and traumatized young people we had been when our family was destroyed. We were now professional advocates with expertise and resources that could help other people navigate similar challenges, transforming our worst experiences into tools for helping others. During the conference, I announced the establishment of a new foundation dedicated to preventing family-based trafficking through education, economic support, and early intervention service. The foundation would focus specifically on helping families in financial crisis access legitimate resources before desperation made them vulnerable to criminal recruitment. The prevention focus represented my evolution from reactive responses to trafficking toward proactive approaches that addressed root causes rather than simply treating symptoms after damage had occurred. By helping families avoid the desperation that had made my parents vulnerable to Patricia's manipulation, we could prevent trafficking before it started rather than simply responding after children had already been sold. The foundation launch attracted significant media attention and donor support, raising over $5 million in initial commitments from foundations, corporations, and individual supporters who understood that prevention was more cost-effective and humane than prosecution and recovery services alone. Marcus agreed to serve on the foundation's advisory board, representing the perspective of siblings and other family members who were indirect victims of trafficking crime. His involvement demonstrated that our different approaches to family healing could be complementary rather than contradictory, each addressing different aspects of the complex trauma that trafficking creates. As I write this story, 7 years have passed since my escape from that compound in New Mexico. The organization I built now employs over 200 people and operates in 37 states, having helped rescue more than 1,500 trafficking victims while disrupting dozens of criminal networks through technology and law enforcement collaboration. My parents completed their supervised release process and now live quietly in a small apartment in Los Angeles, supported by the trust fund I established but maintaining minimal contact with either Marcus or me. They volunteer at a community center that serves at-risk families, using their experiences to help other people avoid the desperate choices that destroyed our family. Marcus has become a nationally recognized expert on trauma-informed youth services, directing a program that helps teenagers who have aged out of foster care avoid exploitation and trafficking. His work addresses some of the same vulnerabilities that criminals had exploited in our family, but from a prevention perspective that intervenes before crises escalate. We see each other several times per year now, our relationship rebuilt on the foundation of shared purpose rather than shared trauma. Neither of us will ever fully recover from what happened to our family, but we have both built meaningful lives that honor our experiences while refusing to be defined entirely by them. The question people ask most frequently is whether I have forgiven my parents for selling me into traffic. The answer is complicated and evolving, but I have learned that forgiveness is less important than acceptance. I accept that they made an unforgivable choice under impossible circumstances, and I accept that their choice shaped my life in ways that ultimately led to meaningful work and relationships. My parents sold me to traffickers for $200,000, but I escaped and built wealth that allowed me to buy their freedom when they needed help. That choice doesn't make their crime acceptable, but it makes me someone who can live with herself and sleep peacefully at night. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it's about refusing to let trauma make you into someone you don't want to be. The girl who was sold is gone, but the woman who survived has built something beautiful from the wreckage. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.